Muchas gracias por estar en esta última reunión del año del ciclo de conferencias, un ciclo que esperamos retomar, y ya empiezo con la publicidad. El año próximo ya van a recibir información sobre futuras conferencias, y en este caso tengo el enorme honor y el placer de presentar a Eirene Visvardi, que es nuestra conferencista de hoy. Quienes estamos en el proyecto de investigación hemos ya hablado de Eirene y sus trabajos sobre emociones en la tragedia. Voy a hacer una presentación formal y luego, como siempre, Eirene va a presentar su exposición durante quizás 40 minutos, 45 minutos, y luego tendremos espacio, como siempre, para el debate, preguntas, comentarios. Eirene obtuvo su doctorado en filosofía vinculado con las clásicas en Stanford University en el 2007, con una tesis Dancing the Emotions, Pity and Fear in the Tragic Chorus, donde ya se ocupó de trabajar la experiencia emocional del coro, ¿no? Y cómo aparece el coro vinculado básicamente con, por un lado, la compasión y por otro lado el temor, como emociones particularmente trágicas. Fue scholar visitante junior en la Facultad de Clásicas de la Universidad de Cambridge, había antes obtenido su maestría en Clásicas en la Universidad de Cambridge, fue estudiante Erasmus en su momento, y sus áreas, hoy como profesora asistente en Wesleyan University, donde es profesora de estudios clásicos, sus áreas de investigación giran en torno del drama griego y el rol que el teatro griego tiene en la vida intelectual y política, ¿no? Básicamente las preguntas que Eirene suele plantearse tienen que ver con la naturaleza y la estructura de las emociones y con el poder motivacional que las emociones tienen respecto, digamos, del contexto social. La relación entre lo individual y lo colectivo, especialmente en el contexto político y cívico de las instituciones democráticas. El rol también que tienen las formas estéticas, las formas discursivas, las formas performativas, incluyendo, por supuesto, el teatro y la filosofía, en la formación o en la delimitación tanto de las emociones como del diálogo político. Y todo esto está muy bien representado en el texto que surge, digamos, de sus trabajos de investigación, Emotion in Action, Thucydides and the Tragic Chorus, editado por Brill en el año 2015, donde la hipótesis de su trabajo es que el discurso coral de las emociones, especialmente la compasión y el miedo, sugieren una variedad de maneras en las cuales se pueden experimentar y percibir y practicar la participación social y política, y que estos textos ofrecen una especie de paradigma de participación afectiva, de participación emocional, que puede llevarse a cabo. Con lo cual, creo que para pensar los vínculos entre emociones y los distintos géneros literarios en la antigüedad griega, y en particular en la democracia ateniense, Eirene creo que es la representante perfecta para presentarnos estas ideas. Así que le voy a dar la palabra a Eirene. Eirene, welcome again. Thank you for having accepted our invitation. And of course, the floor and the screen are all yours. Thank you again.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be with you. So what I'm going to do right now, I'm going to share my screen, and I'll be taking you through a number of passages that I will have on the screen for you. And I won't be reading through all of them. It's more so that you can see what I'm trying to analyze, and then I will only read a few of them. And then, of course, you can always ask me to go back to any of these that you may want. And I'm going to speak for about 45 minutes, maybe 47. And then, you know, of course, you know, I will look very much forward to our discussion. So let me share the screen to begin with. And you tell me whether you can see it. Is it okay?
Yes, it's perfect.
Okay, great. About 15 years ago, one of the leading experts on government torture and interrogation in the modern world proposed that, and I quote here, proposed that we do live in a world in which torture is returning to a role it had in ancient Greece, inducing civic discipline, conferring identities, and shaping a finely graded civic order. So what constitutes civic order and legitimate practices among citizens who share spaces and institutions, which body movements are permitted, and which voices deserve a hearing are issues that have been returning for public debate with quite some urgency, especially in the US, but of course not exclusively so. With respect to torture specifically, of course, I'm referring to the ongoing trials at Guantanamo, where we have alleged terrorists whose testimonies were obtained under CIA-led torture in black sites. So one of the questions today is why torture persists when there is clearly evidence that it does not work. Not to mention, of course, the atrocious violation of human rights. And so this debate and Rehali's sort of framing through ancient Greece has motivated me to look back at the Athenian democracy and see what we have there. So my inquiry looks at torture's effect on one's mental and emotional state. I focus specifically on torture for information gathering and not torture in general. And one overarching question is how torture relates to truth and necessity. That is, what kind of truth does it disclose and what kind of necessity does it serve? In the first part, I discussed the torture of slaves for testimony in the Athenian courts, and I look at how speakers present the truth and necessity of torture and what they reveal about its efficacy and goals. In the second part, I turn to Greek tragedy, specifically the Prometheus Bound and Eumenides, where torture is inflicted on the free. And here, my inquiry expands, and along with the questions about truth, necessity, and efficacy when it comes to torture, I'm interested in depictions of the mind, that is, torture as a psychosomatic experience. The goal here is to gauge what these may reveal about, one, the practice of torture itself, and two, perceptions of emotional life and the inner self. Approached in this way, torture helps us map out the emotional dynamics and norms that are central to the moral psychology of the Athenian democratic subject. So what I will present today is some initial findings and ideas, and I'm very appreciative of the opportunity to share these preliminary thoughts and hear yours. As we starting with legal practice, as we all know, slavery is legal and all pervasive in Athenian democracy. Even so, the need of torture for extracting evidence for trials is not self-evident, nor are the reasons why and how the practice persists. And these are the questions that I will address, but first I should give some background to introduce the practice itself. So in the Athenian legal system, as you may all know, there are no expert lawyers. Citizen men act as litigants, right? They are the ones who both lead the prosecution and the defense. And a well-known peculiarity of the trial procedure is that admissible slave testimony is extracted through torture. So what happens is that when a litigant wishes to introduce the testimony of a slave, and this could be either his slaves or an opponent's slave, he has to tender a challenge called the proclisis to his opponent to offer the slave for interrogation under torture, which in this case is called the basanos. That's the term for torture in this context. And this kind of torture, termed evidentiary, as opposed to penal torture as punishment, is extrajudicial. So it takes place outside the court. It's bilateral. Both litigants are expected to be present, and the questions are agreed in advance. So it's not just the requirement of torture that is very peculiar in this practice. The other peculiarity is that we have 42 cases in which this kind of torture is brought up and is mentioned, and the challenge is tendered. And out of these, only in 2 cases, it is accepted, but then it is not followed through. And then in the rest of the cases, the other 40 cases, the challenge is turned down. So this very peculiar reality has created a lot of debate as to whether evidentiary torture actually takes place, and whether it does or not, what the rationale is behind it. And I'm not going to take you through the debate right now, but if you'd like to hear more about the arguments on either side, I'm happy to talk about it in the discussion. The key here is that whether torture is actually performed or not, speakers incorporate in their arguments and debate the reliability of the evidence extracted through it. So the rhetoric is very much present. Torture's dependability for truthful information or lack thereof builds around a discourse of anange, of necessity, that covers notions of force, coercion, compulsion, necessity itself. And irrespective of the quality of the evidence elicited, torture is presented as incontrovertibly having the capacity to compel testimony, to make a slave speak. The kind of information that this force compels is what comes under scrutiny. So in support of torture's capacity to lead to truthful information, speakers present basanos, the torture itself, as an ergon, so as a deed or an act. In conformity with democratic ideology, and this is the first quote here, in conformity with a democratic ideology which gives precedence to acts, right, to erga, over words, over logos, basanos is presented as an act or a deed. As such, its validity is more reliable than the arguments, than the logoi, right, of speakers, and in some cases, even more valuable than the testimony, the logoi of free men. Here, what we see is that this ergon, right, the basanos, constitutes what they call a most precise akribestodon test that induces slaves to provide true and accurate evidence. And we see at the end of this quote, because no one who has been examined under torture has ever been convicted of giving false evidence as the result of being tortured, which is also a fallacy because, you know, slaves cannot be prosecuted. But this is the rhetoric there. It is presumed, and we see this here, it is presumed that unlike free men, slaves have no motive to provide true information on their own and for the sake of justice alone, right? Eneka tu dikaio in this slide. This lack of motivation on the part of slaves stems from their natural capacities and their social positions. So the citizen takes the responsibility to act in the way that is most suitable for the different subjects' capacities. Lycurgus here pointedly asks, which people could not have been misled by cunning or a deceptive argument, right, a deceptive logos, the male and female slaves, because naturally, kataphusin, when tortured, they would have told the whole truth. On the other hand, which people could he probably impose upon by arguments, by logo again? And here the term is interesting because it's about psuka gogein, leading the soul. And of course, this would be the jury, right? The citizen men. And this is also, we saw in a previous quote, number 2 again, this is also presented as the justest and most democratic course. And one expert on this, Mirhadi, has pointed out that this means that it supports, and I quote here, the societal norms of the Athenian democracy by confirming the status distinctions between Athenian citizens and their slaves, end of quote. So the ergon versus logos, deed versus saying, argument, rhetoric, presents the body in pain as able to reveal the truth naturally, directly, and with precision. And of course, it glosses over the fact that the product of the basanos, the slaves' answers that are extracted through it, reaches the jurors only by being incorporated in the elaborate rhetoric of the litigant. So this is in support, right, of the truth of this kind of practice. On the opposite side of the argument, the infliction of physical pain is presented as a kind of anange, a kind of necessity that affects the mind in adverse ways. So it coerces testimony, but it obstructs the truth. Antiphon presents the argument that is most familiar to us today about the unreliability of torture when he talks about the same slaves' contradictory testimonies. And this here is sort of is worth quoting in full, and I've color coded here so that you see the clusters of meanings. So anange on the one hand and truth on the other. So he says that this person, this slave, before being placed on the wheel, in fact, until extreme pressure, extreme anange was brought to bear on him, he adhered to the truth, right? So anange versus truth, and declared me innocent. It was only when he was on the wheel and when driven to it, but the Greek here has anange, when he adhered to the anange of the wheel, the torture, that he falsely incriminated me in order to put an end to the pain, to the torture. And then when off the wheel, he then sort of tells the truth. He goes back to the truth. And here the speaker says, well, it was not because he wanted to be nice, but to me, he had already incriminated me, but he was compelled by truth. Right, and here the term is anange as well. So the will, the instrument of torture itself, operates here as a kind of brutal necessity, right, anange, that coerces one to say anything in order to make the pain stop. And for Antiphon here, truth itself also exercises its own competing anange on the mind, and here even on the mind of the slave, sort of militating against the argument of the slave, of the nature of slaves. But truth's necessity is eclipsed here under torture's force as bodily pain takes over. So through similar examples on both sides, so I'm not going to take you through more, what emerges is that torture is supported or contested at will, revealing the recognition that its very truth is precarious. And this precarious is explicitly addressed in theoretical works which associate the necessity or force of torture not with truth, but with the appearance of the truth. There's a famous excerpt in the Rhetoric by Aristotle where he attributes the compelling character of torture to a certain anange tis, right, that he sees as attached to it. And he leaves it up to us to decide what this anange is, which is very likely the pain, the violence. But what he says here is that this anange makes torture appear, right, dokusi, to carry truth. And then in the rest that I won't read for you, he goes on to instruct future speakers about how they can argue at will that because of this anange, evidence is either truthful or unreliable, depending on what works for them. So either argument, Aristotle suggests, can be made equally convincingly. And even though later Cicero also points in the same direction by presenting, in this case, necessitas, right, necessity, as winning conviction. His definition is particularly interesting because it includes both physical and mental coercion. And he says, what men say when they have been worn down by stripes, the rack, and fire seems to be spoken by truth itself, videtur, right? And what they say under the stress of the mind also compels in similar ways, because it has the force of necessity. So I will return to this, the stress on the mind, when I talk about tragedy. But for now, I want to foreground that the same as with Aristotle, what defines the coercion of torture is its ability to create the appearance of truth. And as Zinsmeier, the same person who translated this passage, points out in his analysis, we must not confuse these statements with epistemological assertions. And I quote him now: as an authoritative prescriptive discourse, the legal discussion of torture provides no information on whether or when testimony derived from torture is true. It merely provides guidelines on whether or when such testimony is believable. So if the potential unreliability of torture is so blatant, right, and openly manipulated, the question is why the persistence of the opposite rhetoric, and of course why the persistence of the practice, even if it's infrequent. So the discourse of Anangya that I've been pointing out intimates a slippage here. The very presence and tangibility of the body in visible pain compels its viewer to perceive the information it communicates as equally present. And if it's present, it's real, it's inescapable and incontestable, despite evidence to the contrary. In her seminal work on the tortured body, Elaine Scarry points out that, and I quote, the physical pain is so incontestably real that it seems to confer its quality of incontestable reality on the power that has brought it into being, end of quote. So in this case, in the case of the Athenians, that power belongs to the citizen who transforms.
De hecho, la anterior a la que fui la daba un griego historia.
I don't know if that was for me. No? Okay.
No, go ahead.
Okay. So in the case of the Athenians, this power belongs to the citizen who transforms the reality of physical pain into evidence, right, in support of his legal arguments. And what seems to be at stake is the negotiation of that power rather than the truth itself. This negotiation of power does significant ideological work both vertically between citizens and slaves and horizontally between citizens themselves. It appears that enfranchised citizens and enslaved non-citizens must, right, give evidence in correspondingly free and unfree ways for their status to be maintained and to be unambiguous. In this distinction, it is this distinction, as we saw, that renders evidentiary torture a most democratic practice, right? And this is what Paige Dubois has called the contradictory nature of Athenian democracy. The anangya that it imposes on the torture body to produce testimony for the master's use in court affirms the inviolability of the citizen's body and his right to free speech across democratic institutions. And here it's interesting that institutional language emphasizes the autonomy of citizen wish, of the citizen wish as freely driving political and legal will and action. So I just want to remind you here of sort of the formula in the assembly, for instance, the tis agorewen bouletai, who wishes to speak, which encapsulates the invitation for active participation to everyone who wishes to debate. And then in legal practice, the formal sort of language is ho boulomenos, the one wishing to, pointing to every citizen's right to take action in the court of law as he wishes, right, as he freely wishes. But at the same time, the status negotiation that I'm talking about operates also horizontally, that is between citizens, because trials often become the locus for the contestation of citizen status between equals. So access to the slaves of litigants can be perceived as a type of control access to the home, to one's privacy. In this case, basanos, the torture, carries the potential of increasing the reach of citizens into each other's lives. And that includes their citizen status. So on this level, what is at stake is who deserves to remain within the body politic. And that this is key to the discourse around torture and its legal manipulation is, I want to suggest, further brought out in the mythic imaginary, in the fictions that circulate in the Athenian theater. So Prometheus Bound, that I will now turn to, is particularly instructive in this direction. So now I turn to my two plays. The second one will be a very, very brief sort of discussion of it. The first one is Prometheus Bound, and I should say I'm using the translations in both cases by Sommerstein, and because I haven't put it on the slide. I'll just give you a quick reminder of the plot, since Prometheus is not one of the plays that a place of choice very often. So what happens, very little happens in the play. So the whole play unfolds around the body of Prometheus, and the only action that takes place is at the very beginning, where Hephaestus nails Prometheus on a rock, body part by body part. And then for the rest of the play, what happens is that different figures come to visit Prometheus and then go. So except for the chorus who stay. So we have the Oceanids, the daughters of Ocean, who come as the chorus and stay, then Oceanus himself, then Io, and at the end, Hermes. And Hermes, the last one, comes actually to announce two more tortures that will happen in Prometheus's future. And we will talk about them. These are the confinement under the earth in Tartarus, and then Prometheus coming back to light to be tied once again so that Zeus's seagull can attack him and eat his liver. So I need to make clear here that Prometheus' torture on the rock constitutes punishment for what is called his human loving ways. The philanthropos tropos, right? And that is that he saved mortals from extinction by giving them fire. But this torture is also presented as initiating the subsequent torments, the means to extract the information that Zeus needs in order to remain in power. And Karen Bassi, on whose work I built a lot, has argued that by creating this continuum between torture as punishment and then torture for information gathering, the former punishment that is legitimate in this culture works as a pretext for legitimating the latter as well. So in this context, the discourse of tortuous violence as anange that we've seen so far becomes expanded. It is also set against competing forces that compel as well. So the violence of Zeus's authority through torture is one anange, and then it opposes the anange of kinship and the bonds of community. And through this opposition, I want to suggest the play posits the question of the very definition of kinship in more metaphorical and political terms, and of social bonding. So who decides the criteria for humane and equal treatment and mutual recognition, and how ought this to be negotiated is at the core of this play. So by so doing, by creating those questions, the play also sheds light on ideas about the continuum between body and mind in the experience of torture. So the framework for these questions is clearly set at the beginning of the play with Hephaestus, who comes in, as I mentioned, to nail Prometheus on a crag under the supervision of Kratos' authority and Bia, violence, very much present there. And even though Prometheus is designated a traitor, and these are the sort of the passages that I will be commenting now. So even though Prometheus is designated a traitor, Hephaestus feels distress and at the demand to execute Zeus's order. And this demand stems from the fact that he's torturing one of his own people. So expressing deep sympathy for Prometheus, he compares the metal shackles that he's nailing around him to the constraint that is exercised on him because of the orders of Zeus. So as we see in the second excerpt here, he says that he is doing this under as much constraint as Prometheus is being put under, akonta akon. And he repeats that, he repeats the competing power here of his attachment to Prometheus. So he says, toxunkenes, right, kinship, is terrible, very powerful, deinon, and so is homilia, companionship, spending time with someone. And this is all happening despite the anange that again is put on him to do this because of Zeus. In the last quote, what you see is that Oceanus too, who comes later in the play, presents kinship, toxungenes, as the kind of bond that compels his sympathy, right? He says, it forces me, epanangaze, to feel your pain. And that is the sunal go there at the beginning in the first line. So we see here that state power and the power of pre-existing bonds compel in competing ways. The impact of attachments developed through kinship, a shared life, homilia, and close interactions carries its own fierceness, its deinon, and has the force of anange. But despite this anange of attachment, no character helps Prometheus. They all become complicit to the power of Zeus. And what we see then is that these literal bonds that we see on stage replace the bonds of kinship and a supportive community of equals. So at the same time, it is very significant here that it is the act of love, right, for humans, that philanthropos, tropos, that is defined as the act of betrayal that warrants torture. As we saw earlier in the earlier passage, Hephaestus said that he gave honors, that Prometheus gave honors to mortals beyond what is right. Prometheus himself, and this is here, contrasts the pitiless torture that he suffers with the pity that he showed mortals. So what the statements seem to do is that they call attention to the partiality of judgment, because of course this is a play for mortal beings, right? We're talking about a mortal audience here. So this call attention to the partiality of judgment and the arbitrariness of the criteria that delineate rights and community. The torture inflicted as state punishment showcases force that delineates traitors' behavior from a limited perspective and eventually trumps the power of the attachments developed through kinship, companionship, and in this case, empathy as well. The question of kinship as mutual recognition of equality persists when access to information becomes the focus of contestation. Prometheus's body remains at the center of this contestation through his continuous torture. At the end of the play, we hear what he will suffer in the future. And I won't read this whole thing, but his confinement in Tartarus is presented as an embrace in the rocks. And then we hear about the greedy butchering of his body into great ragged shreds when back into the light and visited daily by Zeus's eagle. So just as Prometheus is concealing the information that Zeus asks for, his body will be buried, and the only affection, right, that he will experience will be the embrace of the rocks that confine him. So we have a perversion of this language of intimacy. Even so, Prometheus throughout makes clear that brutal torture is not going to work, and it will rather turn against the torturer himself with equal force. So here, what I want to point out is some of the language of physicality that pervades the play and the way it communicates the body-mind continuum. And I have sort of a few lines for you here and then a final quote. Early in the play, the Oceanids see Prometheus as having too free a mouth. Instead of saying you speak freely, they talk about his mouth. It's all very bodily, very physical. And then Oceanus says he has too fierce a mouth and a rash tongue specifically that hurls out jagged and sharp words. And this tongue will come literally to rub against punishment, prostribete. And later on, Prometheus announces that neither honey-tongued spells nor solid menaces, right, stereas, will charm him before Zeus releases him from the savage bonds. And then finally, and this is the longer quote here, he says, Zeus himself is harsh, right, rough, literally, but he will be shattered, he will be broken, raiste in the Greek there, through Prometheus's resilience. He will have to soften to have his mind or his opinion, he has to make it malakos and level his hard wrath. And then he will come to Prometheus into unity and friendship with him, as eager with him as I will be, says Prometheus. So we have speudon, speudonti, to replace the akon, akonta that we saw earlier with Prometheus. So the physicality of this language reflects how the psychosomatic experience of torture is perceived. The extreme pain inflicted on the body is mirrored in the effects on the mind. It renders the emotions, thinking and speaking, it produces equally excessive and too rough, right? A roughness that closes off the sufferer instead of opening him up. The final torture, the eagle's attack to the liver, an organ that is often seen as the seat of emotion and especially anger, distills this mirroring effect. That torment that is meant to eat away Prometheus's anger only creates a vicious cycle of renewal. At the same time, this language foregrounds how the mind under torture persists. The mind retains its focus and becomes hardened like the torture that the body suffers. And when juxtaposed to the stances regarding the reliability of torture that we saw earlier with evidentiary torture, This play conveys the psychological complexity of the experience and the unpredictability of its results. So clearly, torture for extraction of information in this case does not work. This failure, along with the discourse of Ananya in the play, fundamentally questioned the necessity of its use. And more tellingly, as we saw, the practice of torture helps flesh out the competing types of necessity. The Ananya inflicted by torture versus the Ananya exercised by the bonds of kinship and attachment. Sungenes, homilia, and philotis, that is love and close relationship. And this opposition not only shows torture as a means of violent exclusion, it also foregrounds the arbitrariness of the criteria for inclusion. As we saw, Prometheus declares that he will share the information that he conceals when he and Zeus eagerly connect in a close bond of political affinity, again, this last quote, of political affinity. Shared interests will become the basis of closeness, of arthmos, which cultivates its own kind of affection through recognition of mutual dependency and reconsidering who is to be seen as a valued kin. In other words, there is no natural or necessary status. Just as Prometheus' stance toward both mortals and fellow gods points to the variability of bonds that compel, recognition of kinship and community bonds reflects political choices of whose Ananya matters. And how capacious this closeness or philotes can or ought to be, and who has the power and means to negotiate it, is precisely what is at stake in Zeus' state, but also in every state. And this concludes my my discussion of Prometheus. For a few minutes, I want to close my talk by turning briefly to Aeschylus's Eumenides and to return via tragedy to torture and truth-telling as testimony in the court of law. So far we have seen how physical torture breaks the body from the outside in an attempt to affect the emotional and rational faculties. In the Eumenides, we witness the opposite direction. We witness another attack on the body, but one that embodies an innermost experience, and that is the experience of guilt or the fear of guilt. So this play, as you probably all know, it's the last play of the Oresteia, and dramatizes the mythic foundation of the first homicide court and of legal process more broadly. And of course, this is the context in which we get the first submission of testimony. The Eirene's assault, the assault of the Furies, before the trial begins, provides insights into the tormented body and mind at the aftermath of killing and one's ability to offer evidence. And in this case, it's Orestes. So what renders this case pertinent for the questions I raised today is that Orestes' experience, one, offers a different but telling depiction of the continuum of torture as punishment and torture for information gathering as unreliable. And two, it dramatizes how the practice of torture itself informs conceptions of the psychological experience of guilt. So in this way, it may point to 5th century perceptions of the self and its truths. So we see the first intimations of the Eirene's torment at the end of the second play of the trilogy, The Libation Bearers. And we have the quote here because as soon as Orestes feels the onset of the Furies, the Eirene's, terror begins to take over, and he rushes to make a proclamation. He feels that his own mind, his phrenes here, begin to control him like a horse that he cannot keep straight. And then that terror and wrath set the tune in his heart. And he says, I want to make a proclamation while I am still in my mind, right? While I still have my wits, Emphron. And while here he admits to killing his mother, he assigns responsibility to Apollo. So this is the first intimation that torment of the mind and truth-telling are not compatible. And this torment is also intensely felt in the body. And this physicality of guilt, right, is vividly communicated when in the next play, the Eirene that in this play, in the previous play, only Orestes can see, everyone can see, because they are the chorus of the play. The visceral effect that they are eager to inflict on Orestes is to be thoroughly eliminated. And while Orestes awaits for Athena's help, they perform a spell around him. And this is the last quote here, a dance song that they call a binding hymn, hymnon desmion. So the effects of such binding are revealing for the effect and affect, actually, of mental torture. So the victim is tripped up and trodden down by the goddess's feet that fall heavy on him, and then the human being becomes the sacrificial victim that falls. And we see here that the song deranges and destroys the mind. It's a desmios humnus phrenon again. So as he literally falls, right, this victim, his doxai, which is the first term in the longer quote on the right, become worthless. They become atimoi. And he becomes thoroughly disoriented, not knowing even what's happening to him, with his wits totally destroyed. So in that last aphrony, luma, phrenes sort of come up there again. So his body and mind are bound, and the victim is totally out of control. So just to bring back Elaine Scarry here again, when she analyzes the experience of the body in pain, she points out what she calls the contraction of the world of the tortured person, a contraction that comes about from the reversal of civilization and the distraction of consciousness. And I quote, "Brutal, savage, and barbaric, torture self-consciously and explicitly announces its own nature as an undoing of civilization and acts out the uncreating of the created contents of consciousness." End of quote. So according to her, this undoing of civilization takes place especially through institutions that are being made into weapons of torture. And this is what we also see here with the Eirenians, right? They activate and pervert practices that encompass religious hymn and sacrifice, choral song and athletics, all these practices that usually acculturate someone and integrate him in the community. Meant to bind in collective solidarity, they now destroy and isolate. And the term atimoi here, describing the victim's opinions, is really a marked term in the Athenian polis, because it shows both the loss of honor, but also the loss of political rights. So Orestes' fear that he would be unable to testify truthfully is substantiated. He's threatened to become bound, tripped up, and atimos, thoroughly enfeebled, disoriented, and disenfranchised. But Orestes' case is telling, because despite this fear, he does not become bound. The binding spell is kept at bay because the Eirenians agreed to hold back and have him tried at the new court of law. So Orestes in the end gets the opportunity to give evidence with his body and mind intact. So in the mythic world, then, what the courts create, among other things, are the conditions for submitting testimony freely. And it is worth highlighting the connection between body and mind in the torment of the Eirenians and its private and public repercussions. Their torment encapsulates the psychology of guilt before it is legally decided. The psychosomatic experience that we saw shows a tormented body manifesting a tormented and sick mind. So guilt in this case disorients and destroys one's mental capacities, self-perception, and standing in the community. The guilty mind is rendered incapable to maintain its clarity and hold on to its truth. And this is key here. Through the Eirenes, guilt is presented as a visceral experience that attempts to enforce the torturer's truth. In Orestes' case, the torturer's truth gives precedence to the mother and differs from the victim's truth, the valuation of the father. So what the democratic court offers is the opportunity for submitting one's truth unencumbered by the weight of the torture of competing ethical demands, and therefore before it crystallizes as guilt. The play thus complicates the understanding of truth and shows it to be political, if not partisan, and not merely factual. Killing a husband and killing a mother both constitute murder, but which one truly justifies the onset of guilt is contingent upon the cultural valuation of gender. In this way, the democratic court delineates whose truth deserves a fair hearing and thus whose truth matters. Torturable minds are only those that are proven guilty and are given over for punishment, not ones still on trial, since the experience of guilt is torture that militates against bearing true witness for oneself. Mental guilt, thus, borrows, as it were, the instruments of physical torture to inflict the torment of moral responsibility. And that is because torture indeed carries an anange and necessarily leads to disclosure. But what it discloses has no inherent truth value. It is the political community that decides on its truth and solidified for oneself and for one's kin. The torture of guilt, in other words, replicates for the mind the dynamics of physical torture. So to close, by affecting one's bodily, mental, and emotional state, torture compels and fundamentally alienates the victim in pain. The paradox is that torture and guilt exercise this adversarial, visceral force in the name of collaboration for the sake of the community. Our sources, I have suggested, show that the Athenians either recognize or can recognize this paradox and the inherent unreliability of the mind in pain to reveal the truth. They also recognize that the criteria for rendering certain bodies as torturable are arbitrary, and so are the political rights that they help maintain. Torture then seems to persist because fully embracing these recognitions would necessitate fundamental reorganization of the civic community. Thank you. And I'll stop sharing so that I can see everyone. But if you'd like me, if you'd like me to bring back any of these texts, please let me know.
Thank you very much, Eirene, for a wonderful presentation with a lot of ideas, and you cross not only different types of texts, but also this idea of the physicality and the emotional aspects of torture, and how torture breaks the idea of political communities, and at the same time endorses the difference of status. I think that's a wonderful approach, and I think it was very interesting for many of the present audience. So I don't know, we have some time for questions. There's some thanks in the chat for you. Wonderful, excellent, etc.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well-deserved positive adjectives. Any question? Maybe I can start breaking the ice, because people are a little shy at the beginning, Eirene, and then once they gain confidence. Oh, Elizabeth has a question, so I'll leave the floor for Elizabeth to break the ice.
Let me put my video on. Good morning, and thank you so much, everyone, for putting this together. Eirene, so I had always been taught that torture, actually, that slaves were in fact tortured, and it sounds as though not so much, here. So could you clarify that for me? Thank you.
Yes. Thank you for asking that. So there is no question that that slaves were tortured from what we know as punishment. That's for sure, and we have all kinds of references in the oratory, and of course in comedy, in tragedy, in theoretical works too. So torture as punishment is a given. The question is whether this practice in court that that requires that they also be tortured for information, for testimony, whether that kind of torture actually takes place.
Yes,
and
okay.
So it's sort of that's the division between the types of torture. And I should say that there is the theory that that actually necessarily takes place, but what it does is that it leads to a resolution of a case outside the court when the torture happens. And then this is why we don't have evidence of the practice in court, because those cases don't end up in court.
Okay, so it's something like the equivalent of settling the case, a
Yeah.
settlement. Okay.
I do not accept that position, because there is no reference anywhere that resolution has happened. So it's partly an argument from silence by very respected scholars, nevertheless, right, who are trying to figure out why, sort of in all those cases where it's referenced, the challenge is never accepted.
Okay.
But that's the division there.
Okay, thank you.
I was thinking, Eirene, of this passage in Aristophanes' Frogs, in which Basanos is in fact inverted. So basically, if the slave is the one who allows his master to be tortured, maybe this is because for the Athenian audience, at a certain point, this Basanos and Procles was remindful of a possible performance. But again, this is part of what you would expect rhetorically from an extrajudicial
means
of settling disputes. But that's
that's very interesting, and it's also interesting there that it doesn't work.
Exactly.
Right? There is no revelation of information, and so sort of it really, of course, in a very Aristophanic way, and Dionysus is who he is, right? This very peculiar divinity, and then you have comedy sort of incorporating that, but sort of that there is no natural sort of result, right? Yeah.
And I was also thinking about the episode of the old hags in Assemblywoman.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Because there, at the end, after the police with the women have established a decree in which sex is open to everyone, but you have to make sure that old women will also be benefited from sex. Then, and this is very interesting, when the young man enters the stage, there is, of course, a physical manipulation and this sort of visceral experience because they torture him, in fact. I mean, there's violence. And then when he asks why he's being treated like that, then the old lady says, okay, it's not me, it's honomos anankatse. And it's interesting because it's ananke again. And what's also interesting is that just before that, the woman says that men are not allowed anymore to take part in judicial affairs. So he's an atimos, and once he's an atimos, then he is a possible object of physical attack. So that's very interesting because there's an anke there. Yeah. There's the institution and the social fabrication of physical violence because it's nomos that's doing that. And I think
Yeah.
that's really interesting. Yeah.
Thank you so much for bringing this up. That's such a sort of peculiar scene, right?
Yeah.
And it's supposed to be funny, but it's so disturbing too. And you're giving me something to think about here too, because in this play, you know, the women take power, and because they claim that they are not litigious, right, like men are, and they can have a community without that kind of agreement that nomos creates.
Exactly.
And as soon as you get into a political entity, then we see what you're describing, and the role of Ananya there. That is a very interesting.
Yeah, and it's similar to what happens in birds. There's an initial opposition to politics. People want to get out of the constraints of legal norms, and at the end of the day, they finish creating a new institutional order in which they exert violence. In birds, of course, against the birds, which are also subject to torture from Piseteras. He even cooks those birds who are not willing to accept his power. And then I have a last comment, and I'm just making time for others to think of questions, which is very interesting. I don't know whether you mentioned this, but this is part of what you were saying. In Prometheus, I loved the way in which you examined the text of the play. The word for unity is arthmos, and I was thinking, because I was working on unity and syngeneia, especially how this is used in international treaties as a sort of artificial creation of kinship to comply with a fake fraternity, yes? But I think in a play in which there's such physicality, the use of arthmos from Ararisco and this idea of articulations, and it's the same root as arthron, and so it can also be helpful in order to think of this unity as a refounding of the body. I don't know whether this could be a possible reading for this noun.
That's very interesting, and I think that's something to look into, right? Sort of how the two, whether they are used in that way elsewhere, and sort of what the associations are. But I think what you're pointing out in terms of the etymologies would work really well, right? With all the physicality.
It would go to your reading about this physicality and the creation of a physicality out of a political bonding and union and body and going together.
Yes, thank you very much.
No, you're welcome. You're welcome. So, questions, preguntas, comentarios. Pueden hacerlo en español, y hay voluntarios en el público que pueden colaborar con la traducción. Pueden escribir en el chat si son tímidos. They're hesitating. I can look at their faces and they're, vamos, don't lose the opportunity.
Well, I mean, of course, I would be interested in hearing whether you have sort of other texts or that you think should sort of be considered in this context, or anything that that sort of connects to these ideas or questions these ideas, of course. So please.
We have Cecilia. Cecilia is a professor from Brazil. She was a speaker at our cycle of conferences, and she raised her hand. So Cecilia.
Hello. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the lecture, and apologize for my English. And I like when the last thing you said about other texts or relation to the subject, because I was just wondering about when you quote Cicero, and mainly Cicero in this moment, you talk about the emotions to have the force of necessity. And then it just came to my mind, the Encomium of Helen by Gorgias, in which at beginning, he separates necessity, bia, and persuasion, but then he connects them and saying that sometimes the persuasion has more, is stronger than necessity. And in the same time, it's such a text in which, in spite of all the criticisms that you have against Gorgias until now, even with all the revision of Gorgias and the sophists, but still, there is still some criticism about the text and the sophists in general. But it's interesting also in this text how he talks about some physicality, because when he defines logos as a dynastes megas, as a great sir, he connects with, he said that there is a small body, which is interesting to understand in a way that he used the word body and say about how Helen with a small body took so many people, all the physicality that you have in Gorgias, even when he talk about emotion related to the physical reaction provoked by logos, like the tears, the, how do you say in English, the trembling?
Yep.
Well, but it just came to my mind how interesting this in common is, not only connecting to other texts before Gorgias, like Aeschylus' plays, for instance, or even with other texts after him. It's just a comment, and if you could make a comment about, or thank you very much again.
Yes, thank you. This is actually great. So you see, for me, what you're bringing up here is in any given culture, right? That sort of the metaphors that we use draw from practices that actually take place. And this is partly why I turn to humanities, right? To me, it's, you know, if you need, it's sort of the torture of the body, right? That you see and what it does is the most apt way to understand what's happening with guilt, right? And to sort of to perceive the inside, right? Sort of, it's a very interesting dialogue of an interaction of practice and then conceptualization, and how the two sort of interlace. And I think what you're bringing up is really key, because then that also translates, that also works with logos, right? Very similar to guilt in a way, because it's really narrative speech argument that makes meaning out of what we do, what we see. And there, you know, if you use what you just said, the power of torment in that way too, the compulsion of that, the dunastes, right? I think sort of does more of the work of the, so we see more of the work of the practice and conceptualization happening. And which sort of makes us understand better both logos and torture. If that makes sense. I hope, sorry, it's like thinking aloud, but I hope what I said makes some sense.
Yes.
That Yeah, yeah.
Any other question? ¿Alguna otra pregunta? Mariana, I think she has a question on the chat. She thanks you very much, Eirene.
Yeah, yeah, I can see.
You can see it. More a commentary question. She was thinking about Alcibiades' accusations regarding the Hermes and the mysteries. It seems there were basanoi, and Thucydides is clear about how the Athenians' fervor and their interest in knowing the truth opposes to how they believe everything from everyone. So they.
Yeah. So I would very much like to hear more about the Thucydides part to sort of understand a little better what you're driving at. So in the question about the mysteries, right? I should say that the basanos is allowed even against citizens when the safety of the state is at stake, right? And thank you for bringing this up, because it also sort of, it helps us see how it's really about the body politic, right? So as soon as you become an opponent to the state, then you can be tortured as well. So that's one of the cases where probably the only case in which citizens can be tortured. There have been some arguments about free people but non-Athenian citizens being tortured in homicide cases. But the controversy is not completely resolved. There may be some evidence that that happened as well. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for the quote too. Yes.
I know we are slowly running out of time, but maybe we have room for some extra questions. We don't want to abuse Eirene's disposition and disposal for all of us. Is there any last questions? They're just thanking you. So maybe in order to close this, as if Eirene were in Buenos Aires, promise, Eirene, that we will try to bring you for real, not through a screen, for real to South America and to Argentina. It will be a pleasure for us to having you here. Maybe we can just put our microphones on and give a round of applause, a real round of applause for Eirene on Zoom.
And
thank you very much.
May I just extend your invitation? If you come to Buenos Aires, come also to Brazil. Thank you.
Okay, we can
thank you.
We can negotiate with Cecilia a two-stop travel to Latin America. That's perfect. Thank you.
I would absolutely love that. Thank you very much. And thank you for this opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Y muchas gracias a todos y a todas quienes nos han acompañado durante estos encuentros. Esperamos que la hayan pasado bien en cada uno de ellos. Les prometemos que tendremos nuevos encuentros sobre el ciclo de emociones a partir de marzo seguramente. Así que si no nos vemos, les deseamos muy felices fiestas, que terminen bien un año difícil y que empiecen mejor todavía un año que esperemos sea mucho mejor. Gracias a todos y bueno, de vuelta a disposición para lo que necesiten. So goodbye to everyone and let's keep in touch.
Gracias. Bye bye.
Semana. Chau, chau.